Okay, so for this section of the skeletal system, we're just going to be taking an overview look of the skeletal system. There's 206 bones in the human body, and in anatomy and physiology, we'll actually be looking at the individual bones and the features where muscles and tendons attach. But for now, we're just going to be labeling them, and we're not going to label all 206 bones. The bones of the wrist, for example, the bones of the foot. We're not going to highlight each individual bone in this particular video. I'll do that in later ones. So the skeletal system is broken up into two major categories. We have your axial system, okay, which is your skull, your vertebral column, and the thoracic cavity. And then you have the appendicular system, okay? So these are the two major sections and how we're going to break this video up. So for the first one, we're going to take a closer look at your axial system. And for the first part, let's take a look at the skull first, okay? So these are the bones in the skull that I want you to know, okay? Let's go ahead and first start off with the anterior part, the front part, which is your frontal bone, okay? So your skull protects the brain, and this naming system actually coincides with the portion of the brain that the skull protects. So the frontal bone protects the frontal lobe of the brain. Okay, so we have your frontal, and then we have your parietal, which goes on both ends. Parietal bone. And then on the most posterior end, we have the occipital bone. Okay, and then moving more to the lateral side here, we have your temporal bone. Okay, and you can see this little bone is attaching itself to your cheekbone, the zygomatic bone. Okay, and that little arch there is called your zygomatic arch, and that's one of the features that we'll take a closer look at once we take A&P. And then you have your sphenoid bone. Okay, as you can see, it kind of goes behind the eye socket. All right, so for the face, we're looking at now your maxilla. Okay, and then the movable part of the skull is the mandible. All right, so these are the bones that I want you to know for the skull. And the skull sits upon two very important vertebrae. So we're going to take a look now at your vertebral column, and the first two, your C1 and your C2, this one's called your atlas, and this is your axis. So your skull sits on these two vertebrae, and they allow a great range of motion for the skull. Okay, but this C1 and C2 are part of what's called your C spinal column, which comprises in total 7 cervical vertebrae. So your C1, C2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So here we're taking a look at, again, let me unhighlight your skull. Okay, so this is your cervical vertebrae, C1 through C7. Okay, and in total there's 33. So C1 through C7. And now let's take a look at the inferior, just inferior to your cervical spine, which is your thoracic spine. So here's your thoracic spine, your T1 all the way down to your T12. Okay? You'll notice here that your thoracic spine is where your rib cage articulates with it on the posterior side of the body. Okay? So here's your T1 through your T12, thoracic vertebrae 1 through thoracic vertebrae 12. And then just below that we have your lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so here's your lumbar vertebrae, L1 through L5. Okay, these are the point of attachment for a lot of your back muscles, your lower back. Okay, and this is the location of where your sciatic nerve comes out as well. So L1 through L5. Okay, and then we have the remainder of your vertebral column, which is your sacrum, and then your coccyx. okay, or commonly known as your tailbone. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about your pelvic girdle too, since it's right here, since your sacrum is meshed right in between them, in between your pelvic girdle, that is. So the first bone of the pelvic girdle is your ilium. Okay, that's your hip bone. So if you kind of on the lateral side of your belly go down, you'll feel that long bone or that protruding bone on your hip. That's the hip bone. And then on the posterior end of that is your ischium or your tush bone. This is the bone that you sit on. And then anterior to that would be your pubic bone, the pubis. Okay, so that is our axial skeleton. Again, the skull, the rib cage, and your vertebral column. And actually, it occurs to me just now that I've not really talked about your thoracic cavity. So let's talk about that a little bit. So your thoracic cavity comprises of 12 bones, 12 ribs, which coincide with your 12 thoracic vertebrae, right? Okay, and those ribs curve around. They protect major organs like your heart, your lungs, liver, spleen, and they articulate in the anterior portion of the body on what's called your sternum. And your sternum is made out of 3 bones. The first one is the manubrium, the body of the sternum, and then your xiphoid process. Okay, and this is your sternum. So as we take a look at your 12 ribs, I have highlighted here the first 7 ribs, which actually articulate or come in contact with your sternum, which is kind of hidden here and faded out a little bit. So these first 12 ribs are called your true ribs, and then the remainder of the ribs are called your false ribs because they don't actually come in contact with the sternum. But the cartilage comes in contact with the cartilage that does touch the body of the sternum. And these last ribs right here, these 2 are called floating ribs because they don't even have cartilage that touches any of the other ribs that are superior to it. Okay, so these last 2 are called your these last 2 ribs are called your floating ribs, and then the last 5 of them right here that I have highlighted are called your false ribs. Okay. So that's your thoracic cavity. Now let's go ahead and move on to your appendicular. So let's first look at the shoulder girdle. Okay, the shoulder girdle comprises 2 bones. Okay, you have your scapula on the posterior side, and then rotating anteriorly we have your clavicle or your collarbone. Okay, so just to remind you, when you take A&P, we'll be taking a look at these features where the muscles of the shoulder come in contact with bone. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on now to your upper limbs. Okay, so your upper limbs, we'll start off with your humerus. Okay, this is where your biceps and triceps are located. And just distal to that, we have your forearm, which is comprised of 2 bones. On the thumb side, we have your radius bone, and then on the other end, we have your ulna. Okay, so your radius and your ulna. So as we move our way down, we see our carpal bones. Okay, these are the wrist bones. So here's our carpals. So we're not going to learn the individual bones yet. Okay, again, that will be for a later video, later class. So you have our carpal bones, and then distal to that, you have your the bones that make up the palm of your hand, your metacarpals. Okay, like those. So here's your metacarpals. And then you have your phalanges. Okay? Okay, these are your proximal phalanges, your medial phalanges, and then these tiny bones here, your distal phalanges. But you can just remember them as the phalanges, the fingers. Okay? So you have your fingers, your metacarpals, and then your carpals, the wrist bones. Okay, and that does it for the hand, or for the upper limb. Let's go ahead and make our way down to the lower limb now. So looking at your lower limb, we have the largest and longest bone of the body, the femur. Okay? So there's a lot of landmarks on this femur. This is where your quadriceps and your hamstring groups are located. But that'll be for another video like I mentioned before. Okay, and then we're going to look at your lower leg, your shin bone, your tibia, and then just lateral to that you have your fibula. I'm not going to spend any time on the foot bones, but this is the extent of the knowledge that I want you to have for now for the skeletal system. One thing that I want to kind of go back and touch on is just to remind you that earlier when I was talking about the axial system, just because it happened to be located right next to your spine on the bottom end of your sacrum, I did mention your pelvic girdle with the ilium, ischium, and pubis. Just keep in mind, please, that the pelvic girdle is actually a part of the appendicular system. Okay, so again, if I'm looking at the axial system, I'm looking at your skull, the vertebral column, which includes your sacrum and coccyx, and then the thoracic cage. And then if I'm looking at your appendicular system, then that's your shoulder girdle, okay? Your shoulder girdle, your upper limbs, your arms, and then your pelvic girdle, okay? And then your lower limbs, okay? So that's an overview of the skeletal system. Good luck in your studying.